Thank you, everybody, for coming to tonight's Color Country Camera Club meeting. We have a little bit of a special mashup tonight. We have a longtime member named Ray Muzzy, who owns Ray Muzzy Photography, that was supposed to speak to us tonight, but he doesn't quite have the technology that he felt comfortable doing that for Zoom. So he gave us his presentation, and Bruce Smith is going to deliver it. But what I wanted to say, and I'm going to put the links in the chat, is that Ray, I don't know how this is going to look on video, it'll be kind of interesting. Ray actually has a book that this came from called Creative Photography, which is available on Amazon. So Ray and I had worked on what topics. There's tons of topics in this book with illustrations and pictures. He's been working on this book for a long time, and it is available to purchase. Or I'm sure if we can get a hold of Ray, he can probably sell you one too, if he's got one at home as opposed to going through Amazon. But this was the section that he and I talked about doing, was about on focusing methods, because it was something that, as looking through the book, I thought would be very interesting. So Ray was gracious enough to loan his PowerPoint presentation to us. And I wanted somebody a little more technical than myself, because I'm like very not technical, to deliver this. So Bruce Smith, another one of our technical photographers, said that he would do that. So during the presentation tonight, if you have questions, feel free to ask. If you don't want to ask on the video, that's okay. Type it into the chat and we'll try to make sure they get answered. Okay. And otherwise, let's put yourself on mute in case there's any extraneous noise in the background. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce Smith.
I'm the faux Muzz today, broadcasting from my secret lair near White Pocket. And let's see if I can share Muzzy's presentation here.
Okay, that looks good.
It's kind of weird because my mouse disappeared.
Did you find it?
It's there, but it's invisible. And I need to minimize something here. This is really weird. I need to, okay. Anyway, as was already said, this is from Muzzy's book. And I guess this is a focusing chapter or chapters. So the goal of this is capturing your subject in a crisp, sharp focus. Focus, sharpness, and clarity are not the same thing. You cannot really fix an out of focus photo with post-processing with normal sharpness or clarity adjustments. You'll just have a sharp out of focus picture. There is some software now that uses AI, which can help this a little bit. I don't have a lot of experience in it, but I've read about it. So if you have something great that is out of focus, you might want to look into some of the Topaz plugins. And sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. It uses AI to kind of recreate a blurry photo, but yeah, like I said, I don't have a lot of experience with it. But that would be a kind of a desperation move. You really want to get the photo in focus to start with. Autofocus, which means your camera does the focus. So, okay. Autofocus works best in good light. Low light conditions sometimes causes problems with autofocus. I'm kind of paraphrasing what he's saying here. Of course, newer cameras focus better in low light than older cameras because they're constantly improving. You know, the last paragraph talks about the focus going back and forth. That's focus hunting. So it's looking for something to focus on and it can't find it because it's too dark out, and that's not a good thing. So there's lots of different focus modes, and we're going to talk about all kinds of different focus options here. Wide selects multiple points and it lights up which points are in focus. So if you have different subjects that, you know, different parts of the photo that are the same distance away, you may get multiple lights popping up. Spot focus is you have one point in the center, or sometimes you can move it around if you don't want it in the center. And you put it on what you want to focus on, and that's what it focuses on. So, and there's also focus and recompose. You focus on your subject and then you recompose without changing the focus. So you can get the person in the photo sharp and then recompose it a little bit so they're not in the center of the photo, stuff like that. So let's see. You know, he's talking about motion blur here, which is really not the same thing as focusing, but you know, sometimes if the subject's moving, you need a fast shutter speed. And sometimes you get a fast shutter speed, you need to increase the ISO if the lighting is bad and stuff like that. So let's get to the actual focusing modes here. So if you're shooting like landscapes or something that doesn't move very fast, if AF-S is a Nikon type, so it's single. Basically, it focuses on whatever you pointed at, and it will, once it gets a good focus, it will stop focusing. Compared to the second one, which is AFC, which is continuous autofocus in Nikon, that will keep focusing. So if something's moving in your photo, as long as you keep the focus point on it, it will constantly be refocusing to keep that subject in focus. And that's good for sports or running animals or anything that actually moves. In some of the newer cameras, you know, especially the mirrorless ones, now have different detection modes. Like it can detect faces if you get close enough. Some of them will detect the eye. Some of them will detect animals or birds or different things. And this is all advancing. So this is good, you know, especially face detect if you're taking, you know, portraits and stuff of people. And like the thing says here, that if you're got multiple faces in the photo, it's only going to pick one of them because you can't focus on multiples at the same time.
So Bruce, I got a question. The face detection, is that a setting within the camera menu for most cameras?
Yes, it's limited to certain focus modes. So like some of the Nikons, you have to have it in wide. And then I don't remember exactly what the menus say to do that, but you can turn that on. Some of the newer fancier cameras, which I've never actually used, but I've read about, you know, you can pick your subject, like you can say, you know, try to find a bird and you put it in bird mode and it'll try to focus on shapes that look like birds. You know,
so that would be different for every type of camera mode or camera model. So if somebody wanted to go in and learn about that, they'd have to go to their manual and figure out if they even have that option.
Right.
For the
All the
face
different,
detection. Yeah.
all the different camera makers are going to be a little different. Basically, a lot of times it's the same, but they call it different names. I don't know if they copyright the names or whatever, but I really just do it to confuse people. But so most cameras are set up by default. If you press the shutter halfway down, it will focus. And it may let you know that it is focused with a beep or something. And it will stay that way. If you're an AFS, even if you recompose, it won't refocus as long as you keep holding the button halfway down. But as is, question 1 says here, if you accidentally take your finger off the button, or it's going to refocus as soon as you press it down again. So, and of course, if you press it too hard, it'll take the photo maybe before you're ready. So, and it usually locks the exposure too, but some cameras have a setting where you can tell it whether to lock the exposure or not. Some of them actually have a auto exposure lock button separate than the holding the shutter halfway down. So there's different cameras, different options. It's really hard to generalize with everything. And there's a lot of different ways, methods to focus here. We're going to go over all these. This is the one I've used for decades, and I will not use anything else. Back button focus. You put your camera in continuous autofocus. You tell it not to focus when you press the shutter halfway down. Some cameras, you actually have to tell it that it's okay to take a photo if something's not in focus. And that, for me, works for absolutely everything. I press the button when I want to focus. I let up on the button and it will not change the focus no matter what else I do. So I can recompose and I don't have to worry about it. The camera's in AFC or continuous autofocus all the time in case something's moving, then I just hold the autofocus down. Like if there's something running across the frame, and I just keep the focus point on that animal or whatever it is. Because if you have your camera in AFS, I've done this, and you have like an animal running toward you or away from you, and you're focusing on it, it will be out of focus when you take the picture because you activate autofocus either by pressing the button halfway down or pressing the AF on button. It will lock the focus at that point. And then by the time it actually takes the photo, the subject has moved a few steps toward you or away from you, and now it's no longer in focus. That's why you always want it in AFC mode when you're using back button focus. So focus and recompose, you focus on something and move the camera so that the framing, the composure is different. And as they say here, the focus plane, if you focus on something 20 feet away, it's going to be 20 feet away, no matter where if you take a step toward it, now it's still going to be 20 feet away, but you're out of focus. So just something to keep in mind. Then you have the depth of field to consider. So things too close to you will be out of focus. Things too far away may be out of focus. And it kind of gradually happens. It's not like, total focus and total unfocus. So they call it acceptable focus in the middle there. It's acceptably in focus that you really don't notice it with the naked eye. So the easiest way to change your depth of field is to adjust the aperture. But there are other things that affects the depth of field. The distance between you and your subject. If you focus on something really close, you're going to have a shallower depth of field than if you focus on something farther away, more or less. Focal length, if you're zoomed in more, if with a telephoto lens or something, the depth of field is going to be more shallow than with a wide angle lens. And the sensor size, which is something you don't have a control over, unless you switch cameras. So that's also affects, the depth of field, or the in focus area, as he calls it here. So he's got some examples here of changing the aperture. So you see at the top left, the f2.8, he's focusing on the eagle, and you notice behind it, the refrigerator is well out of focus, and then it gradually, as you change the aperture all the way down to the bottom right, you'll see the refrigerator is now in focus as well as the eagle. So it's increasing the depth of field. And that's just by changing the aperture. Now he's doing the same thing here with distance to the subject. You notice the closer he gets to the eagle, the more blurry the background is. So the closer you are, the more shallow your depth of field. And the same thing as if you're zooming in more. So if you're wide angle, like in the top left, 16 millimeter, everything's going to be in focus. But if you use a zoom lens or a telephoto lens rather, it will, the more telephoto you have, the blurrier the background. That's one of the reasons people like taking landscapes with wide angle lenses. It's easier to get everything in focus. If you get really close to something, like using a macro lens, or there's different ways to do that too, you get a really shallow depth of field, and you can get some really nice bokeh in the background. So you will get the color of whatever's in the background, like the bee picture there. There's probably some kind of a, some kind of plant behind there that's green, but you can't make out any of it.
Thanks for the information.
I can't hear you. You're muffled.
I think it was just extraneous noise.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure. Yeah. If not, they'll come back on.
Yeah, or if your microphone's not working, type it in the chat window. We'll get to those. Extension tubes are a cheap way to do a macro lens. You can put extension tubes on a regular lens, and it will let you focus closer, because all lenses have a minimum focus distance. If you get too close to something, it can't autofocus or focus, period. So extension tubes let you get closer to your subject and override the minimum focus distance. And of course, it will also magnify things like camera shake. The best way to do macro is with the tripod or something to steady your camera. And because it lets you focus closer, it may have a problem focusing on things far away, like infinity. So it just changes the physics of the lens a little bit there. So zone focusing. What he's talking about here is you create a really deep depth of field, and basically you can get everything in focus and you don't have to worry about it as much. So most landscape photographers will focus on something a third of the way into the image And that's usually good to get almost everything in focus. You just make sure you have enough depth of field that it goes to infinity if you want the, like the mountains and the far background to be in focus too. That's something I do when I'm shooting landscapes and I'm not trying too hard. I'll just focus a third of the way in, and it usually works. You know, if you're set at like F8 or F11 or something like that, you're focusing far enough away. If you have a wide angle lens, it helps even more. And then you can really get everything in focus. It's got maybe something really close to you.
Can you go back a slide, Bruce, before you go on?
This one or this one?
That one, zone focusing. I'm trying to understand. So say you're sitting in the park and you're trying to be candid in your street photography. So you're not going to like point the camera at somebody and shoot. So you're supposed to try to have a aperture such that you have a wide depth of field and you have that focused ahead of time, and then somebody comes cruising through and you're able to take their picture. Is that going to work though with the half pressed down focus thing?
Well,
Do you know? Does anybody know?
you said you're pre-focusing in this. So I assume that if you don't want the camera to focus anymore, like you're using back button focus, you don't refocus, you just take the photo.
Okay.
Or you could turn your camera into manual focus mode, so autofocus won't work anymore, even if it's on shutter focus. What he's talking about, I think, is hyperfocal distance here.
Oh, okay.
So you basically set up your camera so just about everything is in focus. You can't get the stuff really close to you in focus, but usually that's not a problem. So, you know, street photographers will use this. They'll take and set up their camera beforehand so that the hyperfocal distance is like 10 feet away from your camera. So as long as something is farther than 10 feet away, it's going to be in focus. So they don't have to worry about focusing at all. Some people even take a piece of gaffer tape and put it on their lens so that the focus ring won't move. You know, and that's, you know, that definitely has its place. And there's a lot of apps out there that'll show you your depth of field calculators, like Photo Pills you mentioned here. If you just search, you know, like phone apps for depth of field, there's all kinds of free apps out there. You basically tell it what kind of camera you have, so it knows what sensor size it's working with, you know, and then you plug in your aperture and a few other settings, and it will tell you the distances, and you can get this set up. And it's, you know, it's good for, you know, basically understanding your focus and your depth of field. So, you know, you can start playing with these numbers and get a feel for how things change when you change a certain parameter like aperture. It's fun to just sit there with the, you know, there's web pages that do it too, set on your computer and plug in different values and watch the numbers change so you can get an idea here. You know, I don't do a lot of street photography, so I don't usually use hyperfocal distance, but I've used it before and it works. You know, it's for things like landscapes, I usually focus a third of the way in and set the aperture high enough. Thing with aperture, if I get sidetracked a little bit here, is you don't want it all the way, like, you know, if your lens will go to f22 or f32 or something, you usually don't want to put it all the way there, because if you push the extremes of the lens, it's going to be a little less sharp. You know, the same as if you're going f2.8. Some of the real expensive lenses will compensate for that, but usually if you push the extremes of your aperture to one side or the other, your whole photo is going to be slightly less sharp, or if it's a really cheap lens, it may be a lot less sharp. So it depends on your lens, but, you know, most landscape people will use f8 to f11 as the optimal sharpness for your lens. you're worried about depth of field, you can go up to f16 or something. You know, some people will go all the way if they're not sure. You know, with digital, you can take some multiple photos with different apertures and decide later which ones you like. So what he's talking about here is if you have live view, I think this is the live view slide. Yeah. You switch your camera to live view, which basically makes it a point and shoot. You have the live view of your image on the back of the screen. And then you can use that to zoom in to make sure that your focus point is really where you think it is. This really only works if you're on a tripod. But it's really good for like if you're at night trying to get a Milky Way picture or something, you can zoom in on the stars to make sure they're in real good focus here. And then you turn off autofocus so it doesn't change, because you know you're basically focusing on infinity. And you don't want it to try to refocus every time you press the shutter. Or if you're using back button focus, you don't have to worry about it. That's what he's talking about here too, if you're shooting at night. If you turn your camera, the manual focus ring to infinity, it's going to be out of focus, because it's usually the actual focus point of infinity is before you get to infinity on your lens. So you really want to use something like live view and zoom in on a star to make sure they're sharp. Or the other trick is to focus on something really far away before it gets dark and then turn off autofocus.
So what would you suggest? There was a comment in chat where you want your foreground for a Milky Way shot, for a night shot. And is it best to go a composite if you want to have both your foreground and your Milky Way in focus at the same time? Is it possible to do it in a one shot Milky Way?
You can do it in a one shot Milky Way, but the problem you run into is really nothing to do with focus. If it's totally dark out to get your Milky Way, all you're going to get is a silhouette for the foreground.
Okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So the best way to do it is to take a picture before it gets dark, don't move the camera, and then take a picture after the Milky Way is up and combine the two in Photoshop.
Okay,
If you
thanks.
want, you know, a visible foreground. If you don't mind a silhouette of mountains or something, then, you know, or if you're trying to, you know, you can set your, a lot of times you can get something in the foreground in reasonable focus, like if you're shining a light on it, as long as it's not too close to the camera. It's more of this thing about, you know, the closer you are, the more shallow your depth of field. But something you really have to kind of experiment with a little bit. You know, all cameras are a little different. So lenses, f-stops, all that stuff. And of course, there's manual focus. And I don't know why he's mixing manual mode with manual focus here, because he's talking about manual mode here. Okay, he's basically trying to get long exposures, I think, in this slide. So, you know, basically manual mode is where you manually set the f-stop. You know, there's nothing automatic like program mode or aperture priority or anything like that. So and you can mess with the exposure compensation if you want something a little lighter or a little darker here.
But manual mode, that's pretty much if you really want. I mean, I've always shot Milky Way with manual mode.
Right. Because you want to control your, basically your shutter speed to multiple seconds usually.
Right. I've
So if you're
also
shooting at
used,
night, you want your camera in, in manual mode. You usually, for Milky Way, you want the lowest F number, or the widest aperture you can get. You want to control the ISO so it's not too noisy. Depending on the camera, how high you can go before it starts, getting really bad. So it varies a lot with gear. And then manual focusing is not the same as manual mode, because that's manual mode is your camera settings. Sometimes you want to use manual focusings. I know a lot of lenses, if you have them in autofocus mode, a lot of them have the feature where you can grab the focus ring and override the autofocus without actually changing the camera settings to put it in manual focus. So if you're focusing on something and it's not focusing where you want it to be, you can just grab the ring and override it and not have to be throwing switches or changing settings or anything like that. For example, if you focus on this, chances are your camera is going to focus on the fence, not the field. So you grab the focus ring and extend the focus out a little further and you get what you want in focus. You see this a lot with fences. Fences are a pain, especially the ones that are tightly weaved, because it's hard to not focus on the fence. Because your camera will typically focus on the closest thing to you in the frame, where in your focus area. Mirrorless cameras have what they call focus peaking, where you can change the focus and it will highlight what's in focus. I haven't done this a lot because I don't have a lot of experience with mirrorless, but it's a nice feature.
so in that slide where it's light on the peaking view, that's what's in focus.
Yeah, you'd have to look at your camera setting, but it usually highlights what's in focus. So basically it's highlighted areas like around the edges of the flower and some of the parts of the middle of the flower. So
that would be very helpful, like in a macro setting when you're trying to get creative and want to see what's actually going to be in focus.
right.
Okay.
And if you're on a tripod and it's not moving, you can actually change your aperture on the fly and watch what's in focus change on you dynamically, which is kind of cool. Basically, it highlights the edges of what's in focus there. So, but you start changing, you start stopping down the F-22 or something, there's going to be a whole lot of stuff in focus. So it's something that's a really nice feature of the mirrorless. And of course, there's focus stacking, where you take multiple shots with different things in focus and you combine them so everything's in focus. This is used a lot in macro and other things. You can use it in landscapes or anything where you have a large depth of field and you want everything to be in sharp focus. Of course, you have to be on a tripod. A good depth of field calculator to determine how far away you have to change the focus for each shot. Then you need software to combine them on your computer. Photoshop does it. I'm sure there's a lot of other software that does it. So in his example, like top one, he focuses on the front camera or front cup, the first cup. Then he focuses on the middle cup, and then he focuses on the last cup. And then he combines the three photos so all the cups are in focus. Some cameras will actually, you can tell it to take multiple frames at different focus distances, and it will do it for you automatically. And I think you can tell it the number of frames to take, and you know, you can take like 100 different distances just by pressing the button and then combine them later. But that's usually not the entry level cameras. That's the more advanced cameras that do that. You know, if your camera is, if autofocus isn't working, make sure you haven't bumped the switch. Just put it in the manual focus mode. You know, if you're too close, the lenses, you know, some of the big telephotos, you have to be like 6 feet away, or give or take, or it won't focus. Some of the regular lenses, you have to be a foot or two away. So whenever I get a lens, I usually look up the minimum focus distance so I get a clue how close I can get to something before it won't focus. You know, if it's just not working, you can take the lens off, clean the little electrical contacts and put it back on.
I've got another one to add to this list. Make sure you don't have any gaffer tape holding down the focus ring.
Yeah.
I did that one once. It's like, I can't figure out why this camera's not focusing. And it's because I had a little piece of tape holding the lens hood on, which went over the focus ring and it wouldn't let it move.
Mm-hmm.
I felt kind of silly.
I've got one to add too. This is Alan. It's possible that your lens might need to be calibrated to your DSLR. I think it's less of an issue with mirrorless cameras, but for cameras that have internal prisms, the autofocus system might have to be calibrated for that lens. And most of the intermediate to upper level cameras have calibration settings in their menu. So
Right.
if your lens consistently back focuses, meaning it focuses behind where you're trying to focus, you can adjust that with calibration.
Yeah, that's a good point, but it doesn't really apply to this slide. This is if it won't focus at all. The calibration will actually fine tune your focus. Like you said, you know, sometimes when you autofocus, it'll focus a little bit in front or a little bit behind.
Yeah.
And then you can fine tune it. There's ways, if you look at it online, you can do it yourself, or you can send it in to have somebody do it for you. It's kind of a long, tedious process. I've done it before.
Yeah.
You know, or you could just open up the aperture a little more and not worry about it. So. So you know, and then of course you can always switch to manual focus. Usually when you're in manual focus mode, especially with a DSLR or other things, you can, there's a little indicator in the viewfinder that shows you when you're in focus. So it's not just eyeballing it, you know, something a little blue or green light or something will light up when you actually get it in focus. So the little dot that your camera's on is in focus, it will light up. And so it's, you know, but there's a lot of different things that'll affect autofocus. Usually it's not too big of an issue, but so let me switch to a different screen here.
And sometimes it's just the operator having a bad day.
Okay.
Right,
I'm going to give you
that's-
some pro tips here, at least one. Okay. If you're walking around taking landscape photos and something interesting happens that's moving, like a bird flies by or you get some sheep running or fighting or stuff like that, you may want to switch from landscape to a more action settings. This is a good example of the AFC, continuous autofocus mode, where you have a subject running toward you at high speeds. And you want the subject in focus. That's why I always use back button focus. I just put my little focus indicator on the animal, hold the focus button down, and it will continually autofocus as the dog moves closer or farther away from you. AFS, this photo would be blurry every time. I've made the mistake and had my camera set wrong and ruined a whole bunch of photos trying this. So, and again, this is back button focus. Now,
Hey,
This is
Bruce,
a-
I have a question to ask. Does El Salvo, doesn't that do the same thing?
does what do the same thing?
El Salvo on a Canon.
I'm not familiar with Canon. I'm sure they have the same thing, and I suspect they call it something different.
Well, on mine, it's El Salvo, and I can do the same thing. It just continually focuses on whatever I'm shooting. If it's something moving.
Right, that's the same thing. Like I
Okay.
said, all the camera makers will call it something different,
I
think-
think that is the term for the Canon camera.
probably.
Yeah, it was on early on in his slides.
Now, here's a pro tip. A lot of the DSLRs, or at least the mid to high range ones, will have function buttons that don't do anything, or maybe they do something by default. You can program one of those to change your focus modes. So here's a real world example. We're out on top of Hurricane Mesa taking photos of landscapes and stuff one day. And you get nice, pretty landscape photos, and you don't really have to worry too much about continuous servo or single servo and all that crap. Because mountains move really slow, so that's not a problem. But then again, you come across something and it's like, what the heck is this little hill next to a fence? That's a barbed wire fence, by the way. And it says difficult. Okay, that doesn't make sense. And then along come these other guys and say, oh, I get it now. And I happen to have my better camera where I have one of my function buttons set to switch my camera in the group autofocus, which is a really good focus mode for big objects for action. So as these guys decided to take the difficult way down the trail, all I had to do was hold that button down. And I get photos of these guys going over the fence here. Now, I would not have had time to go into my menu settings and change stuff around to change the focus settings so I had a good action photo. But a simple press of the button. I may have had to change my camera to go in, whatever your camera calls the setting to take multiple photos. When you hold the button down, because I basically held the button down and took 10 frames a second here, as these three bicycles decided to take the hard route. There were actually 4 bikes here, but the 4th guy chickened out and went through the gate. So then you can go back to taking your landscape photos and
So it's good to check your camera manuals to see if you have things that will save a setting so that you could set up your camera so that it's always set for action. Or I know I have one that I have set that I can dial it to if I want to do take 3 different exposures to potentially get a high dynamic range photo later on.
right.
So it's good to check.
Some
to see what your
cameras have
model
user
does.
settings like U1, U2, U3,
Yeah,
where you
user
can
set.
program them to go into action mode. That's another way to do it. This is just a function button, and all it does is switch me to group autofocus. So I just hold that button down, and instead of single point autofocus, which I was probably in by default, that way I don't have to worry about keeping the little point exactly on one of the bikers or whatever I'm trying to get here, or bird flies by or something. It basically focuses on the action and, you know, the closest thing to you in most cases. So something I find very useful to go back and forth. You know, and there's other focus modes that Muzzy didn't talk about either. Like Nikon has a called 3D tracking mode, where you set your single point on a certain subject. Like if you're trying to photograph a ball game or something, you put it on a certain player, and the camera's internal computer will try to keep that focus point on that subject that you picked as the subject is running around in the frame. And it works fairly well. The problem you have is, like, if your person runs behind something and it can't find them anymore, then it'll usually pick something else and you're totally screwed up then. But a lot of times it works pretty decent, you know, and of course newer cameras have better technology and they do it a little better than the old cameras. But
So what's that called again?
Nikon calls it 3D tracking. It's something fun to play with, but I don't usually use it. But then again, when I was playing with it, you know, with a camera that's like 15 years old. So it's probably a lot better now. The only way you're really going to get good at different focus modes is practice. Try them out, learn what your camera can do. You know, I can tell you the story about the first time we went to Yellowstone way back in, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, whatever it was.
That long ago.
Well, it seems like it. But, you know, I was going there to photograph wildlife, you know, so I wanted to be able to focus on animals. So we spent months going to the dog park, and I would take pictures of running dogs. You know, some of them were our dog, but you know, and that it was a fun time, you know, and you really get to try all the different camera settings, all the different focus modes. And that's really the only way to learn them. You do that, you use the camera that you're going to be using when you go on vacation, and then you get really good at action photos. And, you know, we did a lot of sports too, you know, soccer games and stuff like that. So, you know, really the only way to do it is to practice. And then of course we went to Yellowstone, and come to find out the elk and the bison and stuff just stand there. They don't really run around. So it's kind of so.
And he's got lots of dog pictures from that time when we used to spend all those hours at the dog park.
Yeah, I've got about 12,000 dog pictures in my room. So
So Roger, you had asked previously about that El Salvo term for the Canon. That is the term. Doug
Yes,
typed it
yes,
in there.
I use that a lot.
Okay. Okay.
Well, not a lot, but what if I'm going to take an action picture, I put it on that. I
Yeah.
used it over at Las Vegas for the whatever that Monster Mash thing, when they were wrecking their vehicles and turning somersaults and everything else. I used that a lot during that evening.
Excellent. Excellent. But I do think Bruce has got the right point that practice, 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 and trying different things. Don't save the camera for the good occasions. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can just have questions and discussion if need be.